Karen drives through farmer's market after being told, no dogs allowed. It was a warm Saturday morning in the heart of the small town of Rosewood, where the local farmer's market had become something of a weekly tradition. Stalls were arranged in neat rows across the cobblestone square, overflowing with vibrant produce, hand-woven baskets, jars of golden honey, and rustic loaves of bread still warm from the oven. The air was thick with the mingled scents of blooming flowers, fresh fruit, sizzling breakfast sausages, and the sharp tang of cheese samples laid out for passers-by. Children danced around musicians strumming cheerful tunes, elderly couples strolled arm in arm, and stall owners greeted loyal customers with familiar warmth. Diane, the organizer of the event, was already doing her rounds with a clipboard in hand and a walkie-talkie clipped to her belt, checking on vendors and ensuring everything flowed smoothly. She was experienced, having run the event for nearly a decade, and she knew that keeping the market both welcoming and safe required a steady balance of firmness and friendliness. One of the few rules she never wavered on was the clearly posted, no vehicles beyond this point and no pets allowed inside the market, rules made not out of hostility, but to comply with local food safety regulations and pedestrian safety. At precisely 9:32 a.m., as Diane helped a vendor adjust the legs on a wobbly jam stand, the peaceful hum of morning chatter was pierced by the growl of a high-end SUV engine rolling into the narrow brick road that led to the market's main entrance. The car was sleek, glossy white, and freshly waxed, glinting harshly under the sunlight like it belonged more on the showroom floor than navigating a farmer's event packed shoulder to shoulder with strollers and shoppers. The vehicle idled just outside the no-entry signs, drawing curious stares. Behind the tinted windshield sat a sharply dressed woman in oversized designer sunglasses and a wide-brimmed sun hat that looked less like a choice of shade and more like a statement. Perched beside her in the front passenger seat was a tiny white poodle wearing a pink rhinestone-studded harness and panting softly with its tongue curled upward like a little pink hook. Karen Montgomery, known to most of Rosewood's citizens not by her first name but by her behavior, lowered her window with a dramatic whir, peering out as if surveying a land where the rules did not apply to her. She was impeccably dressed in a pastel floral blouse, cream trousers, and pearl earrings, giving off an air of someone who hadn't so much as set foot in a grocery store herself in over a decade. Her voice, loud and piercing, broke the market's calm. "Excuse me," she called out to a teenage volunteer wearing a green market staff shirt and directing pedestrians. "There's no parking. I'm here for the market and I'm not leaving my baby in the car." The staffer, clearly thrown off, walked cautiously toward her window and politely explained, "I'm sorry, ma'am, but vehicles aren't allowed past this point. It's a pedestrian zone for safety reasons." Karen waved her hand dismissively, her long manicured nails glinting in the sun. "I don't care about your little rules. I'll just be a minute. My dog has anxiety. I'm not going to leave her in this heat." The teenager, trying to stay respectful, pointed at the sign again. "We also don't allow dogs inside, ma'am. It's a food safety issue." Karen leaned forward, her sunglasses slipping slightly down her nose as she stared daggers at him. "That is discrimination. You are discriminating against me and my emotional support animal. Do you have any idea what kind of lawsuit this could turn into?" Just then Diane arrived, having noticed the commotion and sensing from experience that this would not resolve quickly. She stepped up beside the staffer and addressed Karen directly, her tone calm but assertive. "Good morning. I'm the market coordinator. I understand you want to visit the market, but unfortunately, you can't drive through or bring pets inside. We do have shaded parking available just a block away, and some vendors even offer curbside pickup. I'd be happy to help you access that service." Karen's face remained stony behind her sunglasses. "This is ridiculous. I've been to dozens of markets across the country, and not one has ever treated me like this. Are you even allowed to enforce these kinds of rules?" Diane didn't flinch. "Yes, ma'am, it's part of our town ordinance. These rules are in place for the health and safety of everyone here. We can't make exceptions. I hope you understand." Karen's lips tightened into a line, and without another word she put the car in reverse and slowly backed out, her tires crunching over the edge of the cobblestone. People watched her leave, some shaking their heads, others simply returning to their browsing once the moment passed. Diane exhaled, hoping that was the end of it. Karen had caused scenes in other places, the local bakery, the pool club, even the vet's office, but she'd never attempted to bulldoze her way through an actual pedestrian market before. But barely 5 minutes later, Diane's hope was shattered. The sudden return of the same white SUV, this time entering from a different side of the market, caused a collective gasp. Karen wasn't just parked at the edge, she was driving into the market, tires rolling over the decorative chalk drawings made by local kids, swerving past folding tables and confused patrons. People jumped out of the way as the vehicle moved at a slow but menacing crawl, the poodle barking excitedly through the open window. Karen leaned out, shouting, "You people think you can exclude me. This is a public space. This is discrimination." Fruit baskets flew into the air as one vendor's table was clipped by her mirror. Tomatoes burst against the pavement like red fireworks. Someone screamed. Someone else started filming. Chaos spread like wildfire, and in the middle of it all, Karen's SUV rolled forward steadily, her poodle's bark drowned out only by the sharp snap of a wooden stand cracking under a tire. Diane dropped her clipboard and ran. Diane's feet pounded the pavement as she weaved through the stunned crowd, her heart racing not only with disbelief, but with a white-hot anger she had rarely felt in all her years of managing the farmers' market. Never before had she seen someone disregard public safety and common sense so brazenly, and certainly not in a setting meant to foster community, trust, and simple joy. As she neared the advancing SUV, she saw the full extent of the chaos Karen had left in her wake. Wooden crates shattered like kindling, piles of fruit squashed under thick tires, the wheels slick with pulp and juice that smeared across the cobblestones in wide, sticky tracks. Children clung to their parents in fright, while vendors scrambled to move their wares and display tables out of the vehicle's path. Amid the chaos, one elderly woman had stumbled and fallen, and a young man was helping her to her feet, checking her for injuries with concern etched across his face. The musician's guitar, knocked from its stand, lay splintered against a curb. Diane's stomach turned, but she pushed on, threading past the overwhelmed crowd until she stood directly in the middle of the path ahead of the oncoming SUV. Karen slammed the brakes just in time, jolting her poodle forward with a yelp, but the dog quickly resumed barking at the windshield as though it were commanding the road ahead. Diane stood her ground, legs planted wide, her face a mask of restrained fury. Karen rolled down her window halfway, her sunglasses now perched crookedly on her nose, her sun hat slightly askew. She looked entirely unbothered, even triumphant, like a woman who had just returned from conquering hostile territory with nothing but the sheer force of her entitlement. "You need to move," Karen called out, her voice sharp and unwavering. "You're obstructing traffic, and I will not hesitate to call the police." "This isn't a road," Diane snapped back, her voice rising over the din of shouts and barking. "You've endangered dozens of people, destroyed private property, and violated multiple town ordinances. You need to stop this right now and step out of the vehicle." Karen scoffed, her grip on the steering wheel tightening as she leaned forward. "You're being hysterical. I drove at 5 miles an hour. 5. If people can't watch where they're walking, that's not my problem. And I'm within my rights to protest being excluded. This is a peaceful demonstration." Diane took a step forward, placing her hands on the hood of the car, her gaze unwavering. Driving into a pedestrian market is not a protest. It's reckless endangerment. You're lucky no one's seriously hurt. You need to turn off your car right now and wait for the authorities." Karen threw her head back and laughed, though there was a brittle edge to it. "You think the police will side with you? I'm the victim here. I was told I couldn't enter a public space just because I brought my companion animal. That's emotional abuse. I have it all recorded." "You have it recorded?" Diane asked, incredulous. Karen reached into the passenger seat and lifted her phone, showing the screen that had been recording the entire time. "Yes, and this will go viral. I'll expose this entire sham operation for what it is, a discriminatory nightmare run by power-hungry women who think they can bully anyone they don't like." From behind Diane, voices rose in protest. Several vendors and patrons were now approaching, their anger no longer masked by fear or confusion. One man shouted, "You knocked over my stand, lady," while a woman with a stroller yelled, "My daughter nearly got hit by your bumper." Another vendor held up his crushed produce, juice dripping from his fingers, and shouted, "You think that's a protest? That's destruction." Karen rolled up her window halfway, the corners of her mouth tight as she ignored the crowd growing more vocal by the second. Diane raised both arms and turned toward the crowd. "Everyone, please, back up and give her space. The police have been called. Let them handle it. We don't want anyone else getting hurt." Karen tapped her horn once sharply. "I'll be contacting my lawyer," she announced to no one in particular. "You're all going to regret this. Especially you," she added, glaring directly at Diane. "You've humiliated me in front of my entire town." Diane ignored the threat and instead turned toward one of the younger staffers with a phone in hand. "Did you call them?" The teen nodded. "They said they're sending 2 officers, should be here any minute." Diane exhaled, only slightly relieved, and stepped back from the SUV just as Karen slowly reversed and pivoted the vehicle into the small clearing near the central fountain, coming to a stop with her tires pressed against the edge of the decorative stone ring. She stepped out, slamming her car door with exaggerated force, cradling her poodle in her arms like a trophy. The little dog barked endlessly, agitated by the commotion, but Karen barely seemed to notice as she turned to the gathered crowd and began to speak in a theatrical voice loud enough to command the square. "You people should be ashamed of yourselves," she said, pointing an accusatory finger around her. "This town used to stand for decency and freedom, but now, you've all become control freaks who want to regulate where a woman can walk with her own dog. This is fascism. That's what this is." A wave of groans, boos, and muttering rolled through the crowd. One vendor shouted back, "You drove into people, not just walked," while someone else cried, "You almost hit a baby, Karen." Undeterred, Karen raised her voice. "I'm documenting every one of you. This market is going to hear from my attorneys, and once I share this on social media, people will come from all over the state to support me. You'll be sorry for treating a local woman like this." At that moment, the sound of sirens echoed down the road, cutting through the rising tension like a blade. A pair of police cruisers pulled into the edge of the square, blue lights flashing, doors swinging open as 2 officers stepped out, taking in the chaotic scene with practiced eyes. Diane moved quickly toward them, already compiling a list of damages and witness statements in her mind. Behind her, Karen stood tall with her poodle in one hand and her phone in the other, already filming the approaching officers as if preparing for her next act. But as they neared, the expression on her face faltered ever so slightly, her confidence cracking beneath the weight of what was to come. The officers approached with the kind of calm urgency that only comes from years of dealing with unpredictable situations, and as they reached the center of the market square, their eyes swept over the wreckage left in Karen's path. The overturned produce stands, the crushed boxes, the trails of sticky fruit paste leading from one end of the market to the other, and the small gathering of stunned townspeople who were still processing what had just unfolded. Diane stepped forward immediately, her clipboard back in her hands and her voice steady despite the adrenaline still humming beneath her skin. She gave a quick but detailed summary of the incident, describing how Karen had first been warned at the main entrance, how she had driven away only to return through another access point, and how she had then proceeded to drive through the pedestrian-only market, causing property damage, endangering people, and ignoring multiple directives to stop. As Diane spoke, she handed over the footage captured on multiple phones, including timestamps and the written complaints from vendors and witnesses who were already gathering in a loose semicircle behind her, eager to be heard. Karen, meanwhile, stood to the side, holding her barking poodle tightly against her chest, one hand raised as if she were about to swear an oath in court. Her sunglasses were back in place, her lips drawn into a tight, self-righteous line, and she began speaking before the officers could even address her directly. "Officers, thank God you're here. I've been the victim of targeted harassment. These people wouldn't let me walk through the market with my service animal, an emotional support dog certified by a therapist, I'll have you know, and when I tried to peacefully protest, they tried to mob me. I was scared for my safety, and I felt I had no choice but to remain in my vehicle. This is a clear-cut case of discrimination." Officer Ramos, a tall, steady-voiced woman in her 40s with a reputation for level-headedness, raised her hand, signaling for Karen to stop. "Ma'am, we're going to talk to everyone, but we need you to take a step back, lower your voice, and let us gather all sides of the situation. Right now, you're not under arrest, but we need full cooperation. Understood?" Karen gave a theatrical sigh but complied, stepping back a few feet while still loudly muttering to her dog. "They're going to see what this town's become, Cinnamon. Just you wait. Tyrants in aprons and clipboard dictators." The second officer, a younger man named Connors, moved to inspect the vehicle, snapping photos of the damaged stalls and tire tracks with his phone. He made quick notes as he listened to multiple vendors and shoppers describe the moment Karen's SUV had entered the square, some recalling how they had to pull their children or elderly relatives out of the way, others pointing to specific items she had destroyed. One woman clutched a ruined bouquet of flowers in her hands and shook her head sadly. She just kept going. It was like she didn't even see us, or worse, she didn't care. As Officer Ramos took more statements, she began to piece together the sequence of events with remarkable speed, noting the consistency between witness accounts, the clear footage from multiple angles, and the visible damage that now marred what was once a serene and bustling community market. She turned back to Diane. "Has she been involved in anything like this before?" Diane hesitated, then nodded. "Not like this, but she's a repeat problem. We've had minor complaints. Last year she tried to bring the same dog into a cheese booth, and when we reminded her about the rules, she accused the vendor of being anti-canine and threatened legal action. She's yelled at staff, left bad reviews, and once called the mayor when someone asked her to move her car from a fire lane." Ramos let out a quiet breath through her nose, then walked calmly back toward Karen, who was now live-streaming to what appeared to be a small but growing online audience. Her phone held vertically in one hand as she declared that she was being silenced by a corrupt town council bent on eliminating anyone with the courage to challenge their outdated policies. When Ramos stepped into frame, Karen quickly turned the camera toward her. "And here comes the enforcer of oppression now," she said, voice dripping with faux sadness. "Let's see if she does the right thing." "Ma'am," Ramos said firmly, "we've taken statements, reviewed footage, and documented property damage. We need to issue you several citations, and we'll need you to accompany us to the station to file a full incident report. At this point, you are being detained for questioning. You are not under arrest, but if you refuse to cooperate, that could change." Karen blinked behind her sunglasses and let out a disbelieving laugh. "You're kidding, right? I'm being detained for defending my rights, for driving slowly, for bringing my dog to a public place, for driving a motor vehicle into a pedestrian-only market after being told not to, and in doing so, creating a public hazard," Ramos replied without missing a beat. "You can argue your case later, but right now, you need to follow our instructions." Karen's mouth opened and closed as if searching for the correct incantation to make the situation disappear. When she found none, she clutched her dog tighter and walked with theatrical reluctance toward the police cruiser, pausing only to dramatically inform her phone's viewers. You're all seeing this, right? This is what happens when you speak truth to power in this country. Remember this face." Ramos gently took the phone and turned it off before placing it in an evidence bag. Karen let out another indignant squawk, but Ramos ignored her, placing the bag in the front seat before helping Karen into the back of the car. The dog, Cinnamon, was placed into the temporary care of animal control officers who had just arrived on the scene, and they promised to keep her safe while legal matters were sorted. Karen shouted something about canine kidnapping as the cruiser doors shut behind her. Back in the square, the market slowly began to return to life, though the air felt different, shaken, quieter, stained with the memory of what had happened. Vendors began cleaning up the wreckage, some quietly discussing the potential for a group lawsuit, others exchanging stories about similar encounters with Karen in the past. Diane stood off to the side, watching as people worked together to restore what had been lost, her clipboard now filled with damage assessments, names, and contact info for future follow-ups. She felt a weariness settle over her shoulders, not just from the events of the morning, but from the knowledge that the fallout was only just beginning. Still, there was a comfort in seeing the community pull together, even if it had taken something outrageous to spark it. She turned as one of the vendors approached her with a broom in one hand and a smile in the other. "Hey," he said, "think we can get hazard pay for dodging SUVs?" Diane let out a dry laugh, then took a deep breath, grateful that, at least for the moment, everyone was safe. Karen sat in the narrow, uncomfortable interview room at the Rosewood Police Department, her arms folded tightly across her chest, a scowl etched so deeply into her face it could have been chiseled from stone. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, casting a sterile glow over the gray walls, and her designer purse sat untouched in the corner, her phone long since bagged and placed into temporary evidence for violating privacy laws during her attempted live stream. Though she wasn't under arrest, the detention and questioning had begun to wear down her sense of superiority, even if she refused to admit it. The officers had remained professional, bordering on indifferent, a reaction that unsettled her more than outright confrontation would have. She was used to provoking responses, outrage, deference, even disgust, but being treated like just another petty violator of local code bruised her more deeply than she'd anticipated. Still, she clung to the belief that she was in the right, that the market's rules were unjust, and that she had done what any decent, assertive citizen would do when faced with an overreach of authority. The thought of her poodle, Cinnamon, being handled by strangers gnawed at her, though she wasn't entirely concerned for the dog's safety. It was the principle. They had taken her baby, humiliated her in front of her community, and now they expected her to sit quietly while they scribbled notes and asked condescending questions about her intentions. Across from her sat Officer Ramos, her notepad open, pen tapping steadily as she waited for Karen to finish her latest rant. The officer's expression was unreadable, equal parts professional and fatigued. She had heard people like Karen before, people who wrapped selfishness in the language of rights, who disguised recklessness as conviction, who wielded entitlement like a badge of honor. Ramos had no interest in arguing morality. She was here to gather facts, document witness statements, and determine the appropriate legal actions to take. She reviewed her notes carefully before speaking again. "So just to confirm, you admit you drove your vehicle into the market despite being told the area was restricted and pedestrian only?" Karen rolled her eyes dramatically. "I was driving into anything. I was moving at a crawling pace, barely moving at all, and I was trying to make a statement. It was a form of protest. You wouldn't arrest someone for carrying a sign, would you? Same thing." Ramos didn't blink. Except signs don't weigh 2 tons and pose a physical threat to other people. Karen's lips curled, only if they throw them like javelins. "Ma'am," Ramos said, leaning slightly forward, her voice steady but sharper now, 3 people reported that they had to physically move out of your way. 1 elderly woman tripped trying to avoid your vehicle. Several vendors suffered property damage. You can try to spin this as civil disobedience, But that doesn't change the fact that you used a vehicle in a space that explicitly prohibits them, and in doing so, created a dangerous situation. I shouldn't be punished because other people overreacted, Karen snapped. No one was hurt, and maybe if they hadn't screamed and run around like panicked chickens, none of those tables would have been knocked over. Ramos closed her notepad gently, her expression hardening just a touch. Karen, this isn't just about a few broken tables. This is about your total disregard for public safety and the rules that everyone else in that market abides by without complaint. You ignored clear signage, disregarded multiple warnings, disrupted a town event, and endangered families. That's not protest. That's negligence. Karen leaned back in her chair, crossing her legs and huffing loudly. Well, I'll be contacting my lawyer. You're free to do that, Ramos replied, standing. In the meantime, we're issuing citations for public endangerment, reckless operation of a vehicle in a pedestrian zone, and property damage. Animal Control has also requested proof of your dog's vaccination records and emotional support certification. Until that's submitted and verified, she'll remain in their care. Karen's face flushed a blotchy red. This is outrageous. You're treating me like a criminal, like I'm some common hooligan. Ramos remained unmoved. You're being treated like someone who broke the law. We've completed our questioning. You're free to go, but we'll notify you about your court date. You'll need to settle the citations and the restitution claim from the Market Association. The words settled like dust in the air, sharp and lingering. Karen stood, scooped up her purse and stormed out of the room, muttering all the way down the hall about lawsuits, corruption, and the rotting decay of small-town America. Outside the station, she slammed the door of her SUV with unnecessary force and sat in the driver's seat for a long while, staring blankly ahead. Her online following had grown slightly in the hours since the incident, mostly from people with usernames like Patriot Mom USA and Free Barkers. But the comments were already being bombarded by locals defending the market, posting footage from different angles, and mocking her declaration of oppression with memes and edited videos. It stung. She hadn't expected resistance. She thought her defiance would be applauded. Instead, she had become a punchline, a cautionary tale shared in group chats and forums titled, "When Karens Attack." Meanwhile, back at the market, Diane stood before a small group of vendors gathered beneath the shade of the gazebo. They had regrouped after the chaos, tallying up the damage and discussing how to proceed. Crates had been rebuilt, displays salvaged, and some of the children who had cried earlier were now playing again near the fountain, blissfully unaware of the legal implications unfolding just a few blocks away. The community had rallied quickly. People donated fruit from neighboring booths to replace damaged goods. Someone set up a donation jar for those hit hardest, and one kind-hearted artist painted a cheerful sign that read, "We stand together, no vehicles allowed," as a gentle but clear message. Diane looked around at the people, the tired, sunburned, and still shaken group of locals who had worked hard to bring joy and commerce to their town each week, and felt a deep sense of pride. They had every right to be furious, to demand harsh retribution, and yet their focus remained on rebuilding, not revenge. "I spoke with the officers," Diane said, her voice strong despite the long day. "She'll face charges. We're compiling all our invoices for restitution. If anyone hasn't reported damages yet, please do it before tomorrow so we can include it. I know today was a lot, but I want you to know you did everything right. You stayed calm, you helped each other, and you showed this town exactly what it means to be a real community." There were murmurs of agreement, a few claps, and even a chuckle from one of the older farmers who added, "At least we'll all have one heck of a story to tell." Diane smiled, her exhaustion softened by the collective spirit that had taken root despite, or perhaps because of, the chaos. What had started as a normal Saturday morning had turned into a day none of them would forget, but it had also become a reminder of why these small-town traditions mattered. It wasn't just about buying and selling. It was about people showing up for each other, even when someone tried to drive right through the heart of it all. The courthouse was far from grand. It was a modest brick building nestled beside the town library and a diner that still served milkshakes in metal cups. Yet, despite its humble appearance, the tension inside the Rosewood Municipal Court was palpable. Word had spread quickly in town, as it always did, and by the time Karen Montgomery's court hearing was scheduled, the gallery was filled with a mix of vendors, shoppers, city officials, and even a local reporter from the town paper who saw the story as part legal drama, part social spectacle. Some came out of outrage, others out of curiosity, and a few just wanted to see what ridiculous spin Karen would try to put on her defense. They weren't disappointed. Karen arrived dressed not in the subdued tones typically expected in court, but in a full cream-colored pantsuit with a scarf that matched her poodle's leash, which she carried like a sash of defiance, even though Cinnamon wasn't allowed inside the courtroom. Her expression was one of performative poise, the kind of smug serenity adopted by those who see themselves as martyrs of a broken system. Her lawyer, a tired-looking man from a nearby firm who'd clearly taken the case more for the paycheck than the principal, walked beside her without saying a word, clutching a slim folder containing his prepared defense. He had tried to talk her out of testifying herself, knowing full well that her personality didn't play well under scrutiny, but Karen had insisted. This was her stage, and she was determined to make everyone in that room see the truth, as she defined it. The judge, a middle-aged woman with gray streaks in her bun and a stare that could peel paint, called the court to order. What followed was a series of testimonies, statements, and evidence presentations that painted the picture of what had occurred that infamous Saturday morning. Footage from multiple phones was played. Karen's SUV entering the market at a slow but threatening crawl, shoppers jumping out of the way, vendors trying to protect their goods, the dog barking wildly from the front seat, and Karen shouting out of her window about oppression and lawsuits. Several vendors took the stand, calmly recounting their experiences. One elderly woman described how she had tripped trying to pull her granddaughter to safety. A young vendor explained how his entire week's profit had been flattened under Karen's tires. Even Diane testified, her voice steady as she recounted the warning she had issued, and Karen's deliberate defiance of the market's clearly posted rules. Karen's defense leaned heavily on the emotional support animal angle. Her lawyer argued that Karen's anxiety and mental health required her to have Cinnamon with her at all times, and the market's no-pet policy was discriminatory, lacking proper exceptions for those with documented emotional needs. He cited vague sections of federal protections for service animals, though under cross-examination, it quickly became clear that Cinnamon had no official certification, and that Karen had printed her dog's emotional support badge off the internet. When Karen herself took the stand, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. She began with a carefully rehearsed statement about liberty, personal rights, and being unjustly vilified by a town that used to pride itself on kindness. She choked up at the mention of Cinnamon being taken to animal control, but as questioning from the prosecutor grew sharper, her composure began to crack. She insisted she was never a danger to anyone, despite the videos showing near misses with children. She downplayed the damage to the market as minor scuffs and claimed her driving through the stalls was symbolic, ignoring how terrified some shoppers had been. When the judge asked if she understood that driving a vehicle into a crowd was inherently dangerous regardless of her intent, Karen doubled down, claiming the town had left her with no choice, and that she was being persecuted for standing up to bureaucratic tyranny. The courtroom sat in stunned silence as the judge called a recess before delivering her verdict. Karen returned to her bench, visibly pleased with herself, whispering to her lawyer, "They felt that. I know they did." But her lawyer didn't respond. He only looked at his notes as if trying to distance himself from the shipwreck he just witnessed. When court resumed, the judge delivered her verdict with the same unwavering clarity that had carried her through decades on the bench. Karen was found guilty on multiple counts: reckless endangerment, violation of municipal traffic regulations, and property damage. The judge, while acknowledging the importance of accommodating mental health needs, made it clear that Karen's actions had not been those of someone seeking accommodation, but of someone using the language of justice to justify selfish, dangerous behavior. Karen was ordered to pay full restitution for all property damages, cover medical bills for the elderly woman who had fallen, and was issued a 6-month probation during which she would be banned from entering the farmer's market. She was also required to complete a mandatory civic responsibility course and submit proof of legitimate emotional support animal certification if she ever intended to challenge a no-pet policy again. Karen stood frozen as the judge's words sank in. The blow to her pride was greater than the fine, greater than the court fees, greater than even the public humiliation. This wasn't just about being found guilty, it was about being exposed. The crowd remained respectfully quiet, but the satisfaction on their faces was undeniable. For once, Karen's theatrics had failed her. Her tantrums, threats, and warped sense of justice had collided head-on with the law and lost. Outside the courthouse, a small group of market vendors and supporters gathered. Diane stood among them, arms crossed but face relaxed, the tension of the past week finally starting to release. A few people joked about commemorating the event, one suggesting a mock Karen Day, where the town would hold a fundraiser with carts shaped like SUVs and tiny toy dogs with glittery leashes. Others proposed giving Diane a plaque or medal for her composure during the entire ordeal. But mostly, they talked about rebuilding, about how to make the market even safer, how to reinforce the community rules, and how to ensure no one else would feel they could treat a public space like their personal runway. A week later, the market resumed at full strength. The same musicians played near the fountain, the same stalls sold their homemade jams and organic vegetables, and families once again wandered between rows of flowers and baked goods. A new wooden barrier had been added to the main entrances, painted in cheerful colors by local kids, with hand-drawn signs reading "Walking Welcome, WHELS not." Diane moved from booth to booth, checking in with her vendors, offering a warm smile to newcomers and regulars alike. Peace had returned, not just because the crisis had passed, but because the community had weathered it together. And somewhere just out of sight, Karen sat alone in her SUV, watching from a nearby street corner, her poodle in her lap, seething at a town that had dared to say no, and then stood by it.